The rain had no mercy that day. It hammered the glass windows of the quiet cafe like 1,000 tiny fists, blurring the world outside. Inside, the place smelled of warm bread and fresh coffee, a comforting contrast to the storm raging beyond. But even that warmth couldn't soften the panic rising in Thalen Ward's chest as he stared at his phone, the bank notification glowing like a cruel reminder, overdrawn. Again. He closed his eyes, exhaling tightly. He had promised his daughter, Neve, that today he'd figure things out. Somehow, he was a construction foreman who hadn't been called for a project in weeks, a single dad carrying loneliness in one hand and fear in the other, trying every day to pretend he wasn't breaking. Across the cafe, a woman in a cream coat sat alone at a table set for two. Her posture was straight, elegant, but her fingers trembled around the untouched latte in front of her. She checked her watch, then the door, then her phone, leaving disappointment in every movement like a faint perfume. She was beautiful in a quiet, polished way, dark copper hair falling in soft curls, eyes that held the weight of someone used to hiding storms. Her name, though Thalen didn't know it yet, was Seraphine Colden, and tonight she was about to be stood up for the first time in her life. Before the story continues, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of unexpected connections, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Touch of Kindness. Your support helps these emotional stories reach more hearts just like yours. The moment the waiter approached her, shaking his head gently, Seraphine's composure broke. She blinked hard, a single tear slipping out as she whispered something apologetic and tried to gather her bag quietly, as though not wanting to disturb anyone with her heartbreak. Most people pretended not to notice. But Thalen wasn't like most people. He saw the way her shoulders collapsed inward, the fragility she tried to hide, and maybe, because he knew something about being left behind, maybe because he had lived abandonment firsthand, he couldn't look away. Thalen hesitated, guilt tugging him. He knew he shouldn't get involved in strangers' problems when he barely managed his own, but compassion moved him before logic could restrain him. Standing up, he walked over to her table. Seraphine, startled, quickly brushed her tears, forcing a tight smile that didn't fool him at all. There was something painfully dignified about the way she tried to pretend she was fine. Thalen's voice was gentle, steady, the kind you trust without thinking. He told her that no one deserved to be stood up, and that it wasn't a reflection of her worth. She looked up at him, eyes shining with confusion at why a stranger would bother to care. She apologized for making a scene, old habits of perfection slipping through, but he shook his head, saying she didn't owe anyone an apology for being human. Something inside her cracked softly at that. She hadn't heard words like those in years. They sat together as the storm outside softened, and she confided, in vague outlines, that she'd rearranged a major commitment to meet this man, someone she thought saw her heart, not her success. She didn't mention that she was the CEO of Colden Tech, one of the most powerful tech conglomerates in the country. She never mentioned that part, not when people were kind. When she hid her identity, she found truth in others more easily. Thalen, in return, told her small pieces of his life, not the humiliating parts, not the fear, but the fact that he was raising his daughter alone, that things had been rough. His voice remained steady, even as exhaustion crept under every word. She felt a strange warmth bloom inside her chest, an unfamiliar softness she didn't know she'd been missing. Later, when Neve joined them after school, storm-dampened curls bouncing, little backpack covered in stickers, Seraphine warmed even more. Thalen apologized for the interruption, but Neve cheerfully introduced herself and asked Seraphine why she looked sad. That innocence broke whatever wall she had left, and she forced a smile, telling the child she was feeling much better now. Neve liked her instantly, and that alone was unusual. Neve rarely attached to anyone besides her father, but she slipped her hand into Seraphine's without hesitation. Seraphine held that tiny hand gently, realizing she hadn't felt such genuine connection in years. In the following days, Seraphine found excuses to return to that cafe. She told herself it was coincidence, but every time she saw Thalen and Neve sitting by their usual small wooden table, sketchbook open, homework scattered, father and daughter quietly surviving the world together, her heart softened. She wasn't used to softness. She ran empires, made impossible decisions, wore armor every waking moment. But here she was allowed to breathe. Thalen didn't treat her like someone fragile or extraordinary. He just treated her like a person. And she didn't treat him like a charity case, although she suspected he was struggling. She simply enjoyed the calm he brought her, the ordinary decency she'd forgotten existed. They slowly built something, unspoken, delicate, forming in the spaces between conversations. Seraphine asked him once why he always seemed so calm. Thalen laughed softly, telling her he wasn't calm. He was just trying his best not to fall apart in front of his daughter. She stared at him with quiet awe. Most people she worked with bragged about their scars, but Thalen simply carried his like quiet badges of endurance. One afternoon, as sunlight spilled through the large cafe windows, Seraphine arrived to find Thalen not in his usual seat. Nev sat alone, chin resting in her hands, eyes glossy. Panic surfaced in Seraphine's chest. She knelt beside the little girl, asking gently what was wrong. Neve whispered that her dad wasn't feeling well, that he'd been skipping meals to stretch money, that he'd fainted this morning but insisted she go to school. Seraphine's heart twisted painfully. She knew poverty existed, of course. She wrote checks every year, funded programs, supported charities, but she had never seen it up close like this. Not in a father who smiled every day, not in a man who had comforted her without expecting anything in return. When Thalen finally came in, walking slowly, face pale, Seraphine stood up at once. He tried to brush it off, telling her he was fine, but she wasn't fooled. She told him bluntly, but softly, that he needed rest, real food, real help. He stiffened, pride rising, and for a moment she feared she'd pushed too far, but Neve's small hand slid into his, grounding him, and the storm in his eyes quieted. He admitted he wasn't fine. For the first time in years, Thalen allowed someone to see him without walls. Seraphine took them both to a nearby park bench where daylight shimmered through tall trees. There, he told her the truth. Construction work had slowed. Bills had piled up. He'd been choosing between rent and food. He hated himself for putting Neve in that situation. He hated himself for failing. Seraphine, who commanded boardrooms filled with powerful men, leaned close and told him he was not failing, he was fighting, and that Neve was lucky to have a father who gave her love even when he had nothing left to give. The next week was a quiet turning point. Seraphine visited them more often, bringing healthy meals disguised as extras from a meeting, slipping Neve books and crayons as gifts someone sent her. Thalen didn't question it. He didn't want charity, but he sensed her actions came from a place of care, not pity. They grew into each other, slowly, gently, beautifully. But the truth always finds its moment. One day, while Neve was showing Seraphine her new drawing, a man approached the trio, dressed sharply, nervous sweat on his forehead. He addressed Seraphine as Ms. Colden, informing her the board was waiting at the headquarters. The silence that followed was suffocating. Thalen stared, stunned, realizing in one brutal instant that the woman he'd treated like an ordinary person wasn't ordinary at all. She was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company. Seraphine's eyes filled with panic, not because her secret was exposed, but because she feared what she saw on Thalen's face, distance. He stood up, gently holding Neve's hand, thanking Seraphine for everything she had done. His tone was polite, respectful, cold in a way it had never been before. He said she didn't owe them anything now, and they didn't belong in her world. She reached for him desperately, trying to explain that her status didn't change what she felt, but he stepped back, telling her people like him didn't end up with people like her. It shattered her. For days she couldn't focus, couldn't breathe. She had faced corporate crises without blinking, but the absence of Thalen and Neve hollowed her out. One sunny morning, weeks later, she finally walked to his neighborhood, the modest apartment building where flowers grew stubbornly along cracked sidewalks. She stood at his door, hands trembling harder than they had the night she was stood up. Thalen opened the door slowly, surprise and uncertainty crossing his face. She told him, in one long breath, that she wasn't looking for perfection, she was looking for truth, and he had given her the most genuine moment she had felt in years.